My name is Vivian Knight. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like steady, practical, and sensible. I live in Seattle now, where I work as a financial analyst for a mid-sized environmental consulting firm. On paper, my life looks stable, structured, predictable. But if you had asked my family to describe me a few years ago, you would have heard something slightly different. You would have heard that I was the responsible one, the one who didn't take risks, the one who made safe decisions, the one who didn't cause trouble. What they meant, though they never said it directly, was that I was the one who would not challenge them. I was the daughter who followed the practical path, the sister who didn't argue, the niece who nodded politely at family dinners. I learned early that being agreeable made everything smoother. It made my parents proud. It kept conversations short. It kept the peace. And for a long time, I believed peace was the same thing as love. This story isn't about explosive fights or dramatic estrangements. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches, no ultimatums shouted across a dining table. It's quieter than that. It's about what happens when the people who raised you have already decided who you are and leave no space for you to become anything else. It's about the moment you realize that staying silent is no longer kindness. It's self-erasure. I didn't wake up one morning determined to defy my family. I didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. In fact, I spent years trying to convince myself that their doubts were reasonable, that maybe they knew me better than I knew myself. But eventually, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small internal recalibration. And I chose to defend my path, even when it meant going against my family's judgment. Not because I wanted to rebel, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had finally understood something essential. If I didn't stand up for my choices, no one else would. This isn't a revenge story. It's not a story about cutting people off. It's a story about quiet boundaries, about dignity, about the strength it takes to disappoint people you love. If you've ever felt underestimated by the very people who claim to know you best, if you've ever been gently pressured into a life that didn't quite fit, then maybe you'll understand why this mattered so much. Tell me, have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? To my family, I was the safe one, not the golden child, not the disappointment, just safe. My older brother Daniel was the bold one, the entrepreneur who tried 3 different startups before 30. My younger cousin, Marissa, was the creative spirit, always chasing something artistic and vaguely unstable. At every holiday gathering, their risks were dissected, debated, and sometimes even admired. Mine were preemptively discouraged. When I announced I was majoring in finance in college, my father nodded approvingly. Good, he said. Stable, smart. When I secured my first corporate job, my mother told everyone at church that I was settled. That word lingered in the air like a compliment. Settled. It sounded like a life already finished. I didn't protest. I rarely did. I had learned early that my role in the family ecosystem was equilibrium. If Daniel was unpredictable energy and Marissa was emotional weather, I was infrastructure. Dependable, quiet, always there. I handled spreadsheets for family trips. I organized birthday logistics. I remembered to send thank you notes. When conversations grew tense, I redirected them. When opinions clashed, I softened mine. I became fluent in shrinking. Not dramatically, not tragically, just subtly. The way you lower your voice when someone louder starts speaking. The truth is, I didn't mind being capable. I liked competence. I liked precision. There was comfort in numbers, in forecasts, in knowing what could be controlled. What they didn't see, what they never asked about, was that my stability wasn't fear. It was discipline. They assumed I avoided risk because I couldn't handle it. They never considered that I might simply calculate it differently. At family dinners, when conversations turned to life choices, I felt the familiar pattern unfold. Daniel's latest venture would be analyzed. Marissa's freelance chaos would be gently worried over. And when it came to me, the tone shifted. You're doing well, Vivian. Just keep doing what you're doing. There was never curiosity in it. No, what do you want next? No, is this what fulfills you? Just maintenance. I was the reliable middle ground, useful, predictable, non-threatening, and in subtle ways, I started to notice something else. When I expressed even a mild deviation from that image, it was quietly dismissed. Once, I mentioned I was considering applying for a rotational leadership program within my company, a track that would require international relocation for 2 years. My father laughed softly. You? Abroad? That's not really your thing. It was said affectionately, gently, as if he were protecting me from an unrealistic idea. But I remember how quickly everyone moved on from the topic, as if the suggestion had been a child's daydream. In that moment, I understood something uncomfortable. They didn't see me as someone who could change, not because they disliked me, not because they wanted to control me, but because they had already decided who I was. And I had quietly cooperated with that version for so long that it felt almost disloyal to question it. So I smiled, I nodded, I let the moment dissolve, because being underestimated is easy to tolerate until you realize you've started underestimating yourself too. The first time it really stayed with me, it didn't look like much. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic declaration that I was incapable. It was a Sunday afternoon in early spring. We were gathered at my parents' house for my mother's birthday. The table was crowded with dishes that had been repeated so many years in a row they felt ceremonial. Rosemary chicken, roasted potatoes, the lemon cake my mother pretended she didn't request, but always expected. Daniel was talking about a new investment opportunity. High risk, high reward. He spoke with that familiar, contagious urgency, hands moving, voice animated. My father leaned forward, intrigued. Questions were asked. The room felt alive. Then casually Daniel said, Viv, you should put some money into this. You've got savings just sitting there. It was half joke, half suggestion. I smiled. I don't keep it sitting, it's allocated. Allocated, he repeated, grinning. See, this is what I mean. You're so cautious. Cautious. I kept my tone even. Disciplined isn't the same as cautious. There was a brief pause. My father chuckled. Honey, there's nothing wrong with being cautious. That's why you're stable. The conversation pivoted back to Daniel's numbers. My clarification dissolved mid-air. It was small, almost invisible. But I remember the exact sensation, like someone gently placing a lid over something that had just begun to breathe. I hadn't been defensive. I hadn't criticized Daniel's idea. I had simply corrected a word. Disciplined, not cautious. But the correction didn't stick. Their version of me was stronger than my own description. Later that afternoon, I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing plates while my mother dried them. She glanced at me and said softly, "You know, your brother just wants you to take more chances. We worry that you limit yourself." I dried my hands slowly. "Do you?" She hesitated. "We just don't want you to miss out because you're afraid." Afraid? The word landed more heavily than the earlier laughter. I wasn't afraid. I was strategic. I built emergency funds. I diversified investments. I researched before I acted. At work, those traits were praised, promoted, rewarded. At home, they were reinterpreted as timidity. And the strangest part was that no one meant harm. There was no malice in her tone, just genuine concern, shaped by a narrative they had long accepted. That's why it cut, because it wasn't loud enough to fight. It wasn't cruel enough to confront. It was just subtle enough to slide into me quietly and sit there. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my leather planner, the one I carried everywhere, and reviewed my 5-year financial projections, international mobility, graduate certifications, leadership track eligibility. My life was not small, but I realized something unsettling. The people closest to me couldn't see its scale, and I hadn't yet decided whether that was my fault for staying quiet, or theirs for never asking deeper questions. What makes subtle dismissal dangerous is not the first instance, it's the repetition. After that Sunday, I began noticing the pattern more clearly, not because it intensified, but because it never changed. At my cousin Marissa's gallery showcase, I congratulated her on securing a small but promising partnership with a local design studio. She glowed under the attention, and I meant every word of encouragement. An hour later, someone asked me about work. "I'm leading a cross-regional forecasting project now," I said. "It's preparing our firm for expansion into 2 new states." My uncle blinked. "So, more spreadsheets?" A few polite laughs followed. I smiled automatically, something like that. The conversation drifted back to Marissa's installations. Bold, expressive, photogenic. My work wasn't visible in the same way. It didn't hang on walls. It didn't make for interesting photos. It lived in projections, contracts, and future stability. But the implication lingered. More spreadsheets, as if complexity could be reduced to something dull and harmless. Over time, the comments became almost rhythmic. "You've always been the practical one. You don't need much excitement. Vivian's happy as long as everything's organized." They said it fondly. That's what made it confusing. There was love in the tone, but there was also confinement in the assumption. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I started cooperating with it. When someone joked about me being risk-averse, I laughed too. When they implied I preferred safety over ambition, I didn't correct them anymore. It felt exhausting to explain myself repeatedly. Easier to accept the shorthand. There's a specific fatigue that comes from constantly clarifying who you are. So I stopped. At family dinners, I listened more than I spoke. I offered logistical help. I calculated tips. I booked reservations. I remained efficient, reliable, neutral, useful. And invisibility, when it's praised, can start to feel like a virtue. I told myself it didn't matter, that my career progression spoke for itself, that external validation wasn't necessary. But something subtle was shifting internally. Each time they framed my discipline as fear, a small doubt surfaced. Not about my competence, but about my boldness. Was I playing it safe? Was I choosing predictability because it was easier than challenging myself? Was I, without realizing it, becoming the version of me they expected? The repetition didn't wound me dramatically, it wore me down quietly. And the hardest part? They genuinely believed they were encouraging me. My father once said, "You know, Viv, it wouldn't hurt you to be a little more adventurous. Daniel lives fully. Marissa lives passionately. You live responsibly." He meant it as advice, but I heard hierarchy in it. Passion, adventure, then responsibility, as if it were consolation. I nodded like I always did, because confronting something that mild would make me look overly sensitive, and I had built a reputation for being unshakable. But inside, I began to understand something important. When people repeatedly define you in small ways, they are also quietly limiting the size of your future in their minds. And if you don't interrupt it, eventually, you might start limiting yourself too. It took me a while to realize that I wasn't just being underestimated. I had been assigned a role. Every family has one: the peacemaker, the rebel, the achiever, the fragile one. These roles aren't formally discussed. They're absorbed, reinforced, repeated until they become structural. Mine was simple: the dependable daughter, the rational sister, the stable one who would never disrupt the system. And once a role benefits the group, it becomes very difficult to step outside of it. I saw it clearly the Thanksgiving my brother announced he was moving across the country for a new venture. My mother was anxious. My father was skeptical. Marissa was dramatic about how much she'd miss him. The emotional temperature of the room spiked quickly, and instinctively all eyes drifted toward me, not because I had been asked to mediate, because it was understood that I would. "Vivian, what do you think?" my mother asked. It wasn't a question about my opinion. It was a request for stabilization. I chose my words carefully. Daniel's done his research. He knows what he's walking into. We've all seen him pivot before. He'll manage. The room softened. My father exhaled. My mother nodded slowly. The tension diffused. Order restored. I wasn't praised. I wasn't thanked. I was simply expected. Later that evening, while stacking dishes in the kitchen, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. Calm expression, controlled tone, no visible frustration. And I had a strange realization. No one ever looked to me when something bold needed defending. They looked to me when something emotional needed neutralizing. I was infrastructure, not momentum. It wasn't that they believed I lacked depth. It was that they relied on my steadiness so much that they forgot I might also want expansion. When I mentioned, cautiously, that I had been shortlisted for the International Leadership Program at work, the response was immediate but subtle. "That's intense," my father said. "Wouldn't that be overwhelming?" my mother added. Daniel smirked lightly. "You? In high-pressure overseas rotations?" He didn't say I couldn't. He just sounded unconvinced. And there it was again, that quiet containment, not a prohibition, not even criticism, just doubt packaged as concern. For the first time, instead of brushing it off, I studied it. If Daniel had said he was relocating internationally, the room would have buzzed with impressed anxiety. If Marissa had announced an artist residency abroad, there would have been an emotional celebration. But when I expressed ambition, it was filtered through fragility, as if my identity couldn't stretch that far. That night, I opened my planner again and wrote one sentence across the top of a blank page. Who decided this was my role? The uncomfortable answer was layered. They reinforced it, but I maintained it. And the more reliable I became, the more invisible my aspirations felt. I wasn't angry yet, but I was beginning to see the edges of the box. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a glass conference room overlooking Elliott Bay. I was presenting a long-range financial resilience model to our executive team, projections tied to climate risk exposure and infrastructure investment. It was the kind of work that requires patience to build and courage to defend. Halfway through the presentation, our COO interrupted me. "Walk us through the downside scenario again," he said. Not dismissively, not skeptically, just directly. I did, calmly. We discussed risk tolerance, capital allocation, regulatory volatility. They challenged assumptions. I responded with data. We debated, adjusted, refined, and at the end of the meeting, the CEO said, "Vivian, this is the clearest strategic framing we've seen all quarter. If we move forward with expansion, it'll be because this model gave us confidence." There was no applause, no theatrics, just a professional acknowledgement. But I felt something steady click into place inside me. These men, seasoned executives with decades of experience, trusted my judgment in high-stakes decisions affecting millions of dollars. They didn't treat my discipline as fear. They didn't frame my caution as a limitation. They recognized it as leadership. That afternoon, I walked back to my apartment slower than usual. Seattle's sky was low and silver, the kind of muted light that makes the city feel introspective. And I asked myself something I had been avoiding for years. Why does my family see fragility where the world sees capability? It wasn't resentment. Not yet. It was clarity. For the first time, I separated their perception from my identity. Their narrative about me had been formed when I was younger, quieter, more accommodating, eager to please. They had frozen that version in place, but I had evolved. The realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't make me want to confront anyone immediately. It made me want to observe more carefully. A week later, at another family dinner, the topic of my potential international program surfaced again. My father said, "You don't need to prove anything by pushing yourself into something overwhelming." I didn't defend myself this time. I simply watched the room. No one asked what the program actually entailed. No one asked what I wanted from it. The assumption was already installed. I would choose the safe option. And for the first time, instead of absorbing the doubt, I rejected it internally, silently. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't persuade. I just stopped accepting their version as the truth. Something subtle shifted in the power dynamic, not externally, but within me. I realized that I had been seeking their understanding as permission, and I no longer needed it. That night, I opened my planner and circled the application deadline for the International Leadership Program, not as a fantasy, not as a quiet rebellion, but as a decision I would make based on my own evaluation, not their comfort. It was the first time I understood that standing up to prejudice doesn't always begin with confrontation. Sometimes it begins with withdrawing your agreement. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflex, a smoothing mechanism, a way to keep rooms calm and conversations light. Now it has become deliberate. There's a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you are measuring the room. At the next family gathering, Daniel announced another pivot, a strategic shift in his company's direction. My father had questions. Marissa had concerns. The usual emotional choreography began. And as expected, my mother turned to me. Vivian, what do you think? In the past, I would have stabilized the atmosphere immediately, offered reassurance, balanced optimism with realism, helped everyone feel grounded. This time, I paused, not dramatically, just long enough to feel the weight of the expectation. I think Daniel will decide what aligns with his goals, I said evenly. No cushioning, no mediating. The room didn't destabilize, but it didn't settle either. My father pressed further. But is it smart? I don't have enough data to evaluate it, I replied calmly. That was true. And it was also the first time I refused to absorb responsibility for someone else's emotional equilibrium. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was unfamiliar. Later that evening, my mother pulled me aside. You seem distant tonight. I was listening, I said. She studied my face as if trying to decode something new. And that's when I understood the risk of changing roles. People notice. When you stop performing your assigned function, the system adjusts awkwardly. Over the next few weeks, I practiced restraint. When someone described me as risk-averse, I didn't correct them. When someone implied I preferred comfort over ambition, I didn't defend myself. Not because I agreed, because I was conserving energy. I had spent years trying to gently reshape their perception through explanation. It hadn't worked, so I shifted strategy. I stopped arguing for my capability. I started building evidence. At work, I finalized my application for the International Leadership Program. I updated certifications, strengthened my portfolio, quietly requested letters of recommendation. I didn't mention it at dinner. Silence, I realized, can be misread as weakness, but it can also be cover. My father once said over the phone, I'm glad you're not chasing something reckless like your brother. Stability suits you. I let him finish. Stability can be strategic, I said simply. He hummed in agreement, unaware of the layers beneath the sentence. They thought my quiet meant compliance. They didn't see that it meant evaluation. And the more I withheld my internal process from them, the more I recognized something liberating. I didn't owe them a preview of my evolution. Standing up against prejudice doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires letting people underestimate you while you prepare for a move they never anticipated. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't about keeping peace. It was about choosing timing. Preparation doesn't always look impressive from the outside. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. While my family continued seeing me as the stable constant in their lives, I began building something they couldn't measure. The International Leadership Program wasn't just a relocation opportunity. It was a gateway. Executive mentorship, cross-border strategy authority, equity incentives, and accelerated promotion. It was the kind of move that permanently shifts trajectory, but it required more than competence. It required proof of resilience. So I studied myself the way I studied financial models. Where were my weaknesses? Where would they challenge me? What narrative would they use to test my limits? I enrolled in a negotiation intensive on weekends. Quietly. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone at dinner that I was practicing high-pressure simulations with former diplomats and corporate litigators. I began tracking my own decision-making patterns, documenting emotional triggers, stress responses, and blind spots. If I were going to leave the country and lead in unfamiliar territory, I needed to know myself thoroughly. At night, my leather planner became less about scheduling and more about strategy. 3 columns filled most pages: risk, leverage, consequence. I mapped out financial reserves that would support relocation without dependence. I reviewed contractual clauses. I evaluated housing markets abroad. I researched healthcare systems, not because I doubted myself, because preparation eliminates excuses. Meanwhile, at home, nothing seemed different. My mother still asked me to organize holiday itineraries. My father still forwarded me articles about maintaining stability in uncertain times. Daniel still teased me for having an emergency fund for my emergency fund. They saw consistency. They didn't see momentum. There's a quiet power in being underestimated. People stop scrutinizing you. They stop guarding against you. They assume your moves will always be moderate. And I let them. One evening, Daniel called to vent about investor pressure. As he spoke, I realized something almost startling. I was no longer absorbing his emotional volatility. I was analyzing it. You might want to diversify your advisory board, I suggested calmly. Right now, you're reacting to the loudest voices. There was a pause on the line. Since when did you get so strategic? He joked. I didn't correct him. I had always been strategic. He had just never needed to see it. Weeks passed. Then I received a formal email. I had advanced to the final selection round for the International Leadership Program. I read it twice, not with celebration, with calibration. What would acceptance mean? What relationships would shift? What narratives would collapse? I thought about my father's gentle skepticism, my mother's worry disguised as care, the subtle smiles when my ambitions were treated as theoretical. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to soften my success to make it more digestible. I felt clarity. I wasn't preparing to prove them wrong. I was preparing to remove their ability to define me. They believed my discipline was fear. They believed my stability was a limitation. What they never noticed was that I had been building capacity, not comfort. There's a difference. Comfort seeks safety. Capacity seeks growth. And capacity, once built, doesn't ask permission to expand. When I closed my planner that night, I realized something profound. For years, I had tried to correct their perception through explanation. Now I would correct it through reality, not loudly, not aggressively, but irreversibly. The email arrived on a Thursday at 6:12 p.m. Subject line: International Leadership Cohort. Final selection decision. I didn't open it immediately, not out of fear, out of discipline. I closed my office door, sat down, and let my breathing settle into something even. If the answer was no, I wanted to receive it with composure. If it was yes, I wanted clarity, not adrenaline. When I finally clicked, the first word I saw was congratulations. There are moments in life that people imagine will feel explosive, cinematic. This wasn't one of them. It felt quiet, solid, almost still. I read the email 3 times, absorbing details. 2-year rotational assignment, initial placement, London. Executive sponsor assigned. Compensation adjustment, relocation support, performance-based equity. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a structural advancement. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the window. Seattle's skyline looked unchanged. Cars moved, lights flickered on in neighboring buildings. The world did not react. And that stillness gave me something unexpected: perspective. This was leverage, not in a manipulative sense, not as a weapon, but as proof. For years, the subtle narrative around me had been that I thrived within limits, that I preferred predictability, that I would avoid intensity. And here, in my hands, was a decision that required boldness, relocation, exposure, and leadership under scrutiny. No one had handed it to me out of pity. No one had softened standards for me. I had competed, and I had been chosen. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text Daniel. I didn't announce anything. Instead, I opened my planner. On one page, I wrote, "What changes when I accept?" Underneath it, I listed columns again. Professional trajectory, accelerated. Financial independence, amplified. Geographic relocation, immediate. Family dynamic, destabilized. That last line wasn't dramatic. It was observational. If I moved abroad, I would no longer be physically available for spontaneous family crises. I would no longer be the automatic mediator at holidays. I would no longer be the quiet infrastructure that smoothed tension in real time. My absence would be felt, not emotionally, but structurally. And that realization brought no pleasure, only clarity. Because this wasn't about escaping them, it was about stepping fully into myself. I also understood something else. If I shared the news prematurely, it would become a debate. They would frame it as overwhelming, risky, unnecessary. They would ask whether I was sure, whether it aligned with my personality. They would unintentionally shrink it again. So I decided something important. They would not be consulted about whether I was capable. They would be informed after I had already chosen, not as defiance, as a boundary. That night, I walked home slowly through cool evening air. My phone buzzed once, a family group chat notification about Thanksgiving logistics. "Viv, can you look at flights for everyone?" My mother wrote. I smiled faintly. They had no idea that in less than 3 months, I would be the one crossing an ocean. The power of the moment wasn't in the acceptance itself. It was in understanding that I no longer needed their agreement to move forward. For the first time, I held something that contradicted their quiet assumptions, and I didn't rush to explain it. I simply let it exist. Leverage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. And that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the acceptance email still open on my laptop, I felt something steady settle inside me. My life was about to expand. And whether they understood it or not, I was going. There's a quiet space between being chosen and choosing back. For 3 days, I didn't respond to the acceptance email, not because I was hesitating, because I was evaluating. I've always believed that decisions reveal more about you than opportunities do. Opportunities can arrive unexpectedly. Decisions are deliberate. On the third evening, I sat at my dining table with 2 documents open side by side: the formal offer letter from the London placement, and my current employment contract is in Seattle. Technically, I had options. I could decline and remain where I was, stable, respected, on a steady upward path. My salary would increase gradually. My family would feel reassured. The narrative about me would remain intact. I could request deferment, frame it as not the right time. That would soften the impact. Give everyone time to adjust to the idea. Keep me within the boundaries they were comfortable with. Or I could accept fully. Relocation confirmed, departure date scheduled. Transition underway before Thanksgiving. The first two options were reversible. The third was not. That mattered, because this wasn't only a career move, it was a structural declaration. If I accepted, I would be making a statement, not verbally but practically, that my life decisions were no longer filtered through family approval, that I was capable of navigating intensity, uncertainty, and expansion without their reassurance. And once demonstrated, that truth couldn't be undone. I thought about my father's voice. You don't need to push yourself into something overwhelming. I thought about my mother's careful concern. We just don't want you to miss out because you're afraid. And I asked myself honestly, was I accepting to prove something? If I were, I would decline. Proving people wrong is unstable fuel. It burns hot and fades fast. But when I examined my motives carefully, I found something steadier underneath. Curiosity, ambition, expansion. I wanted the pressure. I wanted the unfamiliarity. I wanted to test myself beyond the identity they had preserved for me. The truth was simple. Staying would be easier emotionally. Leaving would be true professionally. And at 34, I understood something I hadn't at 24. Ease is not always alignment. Around midnight, I closed both documents and opened a blank page in my planner. At the top, I wrote, "If I don't go, will I regret it?" The answer surfaced immediately. Yes. Not because of prestige, not because of money, but because I would have declined growth to preserve comfort, theirs and mine. That realization made the decision irreversible in my mind. The next morning at 8:07 a.m., I replied to the email. I am honored to accept the London rotational assignment. Please advise on next steps. I hit send. No announcement. No dramatic pause. Just action. The moment passed quietly. My inbox refreshed. A calendar invitation for onboarding appeared. Life moved forward. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I chose a path I knew my family would question, without asking them first. Not because I stopped loving them, but because I had finally chosen myself without negotiation. Once I accepted the offer, the emotion of it disappeared almost immediately. What replaced it was structure, which in many ways was comforting. Bold decisions sound dramatic when you retell them. In reality, they dissolve into documentation, timelines, legal language, spreadsheets. Within 48 hours, my inbox filled with attachments, relocation agreements, compensation adjustments, visa requirements, tax equalization briefings, and onboarding schedules for London. The romance of moving abroad translated into clauses and compliance, and I moved through each step methodically. I scheduled a consultation with an immigration advisor during my lunch break. I blocked 2 afternoons for biometric appointments. I opened a multi-currency account and transferred funds in staggered increments to avoid volatility. I read every paragraph of the relocation contract twice, once for understanding, once for leverage. There is power in knowing the fine print. I negotiated one small clause about housing flexibility. I clarified performance review benchmarks tied to equity allocation. I requested written confirmation of repatriation options after the 2-year rotation. No one at home knew any of this was happening, not because I was trying to deceive them, but because I wanted the foundation poured before anyone had the chance to question the architecture. If I had mentioned it early, it would have become a family project, a family concern, a family debate. Have you thought about the weather? London is expensive. What if it's too stressful? You've never lived that far away. None of those questions would have been malicious, but each one would have subtly framed the move as precarious, as something I might not be built for. And I was no longer willing to audition for my own capability. So I said nothing. At home, I began sorting my apartment quietly. 3 piles formed in my living room over several evenings. Ship, store, release. The release pile was the largest. Books I'd already absorbed, kitchen appliances I rarely use, decorative items that had followed me through 3 different leases without meaning much. Letting go of objects felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected. For years, I had optimized for stability. Leases renewed, furniture chosen for longevity, routines preserved. Now, I was dismantling that infrastructure deliberately. I notified my landlord. I researched storage facilities. I digitized personal records. I told my manager about my final Seattle workday. I drafted transition documents for my team. I mentored the analyst who would inherit my projects. Professionally, everything was seamless, predictable, orderly. At home in the family group chat, nothing changed. My mother asked about Thanksgiving travel coordination. Daniel sent an article about market volatility. My father forwarded a podcast episode on building long-term stability. The irony wasn't lost on me. One Sunday afternoon, my mother called. "Can you host Christmas this year?" she asked. "Daniel might be traveling, and it would help if you handled logistics." There it was again. The assigned role. Organizer, stabilizer, infrastructure. I paused, not to dramatize, but to decide timing. It was late October. My departure date was mid-November. The visa was approved. The housing contract in London was signed. My flights were booked. My resignation from the Seattle office had been formally processed into the international transfer. There was nothing theoretical left. "I won't be here for Christmas," I said gently. "Oh?" she replied casually. "Work trip?" "I'm relocating to London in November, 2-year leadership rotation." Silence doesn't always erupt. Sometimes it compresses. The line went quiet long enough for me to hear the faint hum of her kitchen in the background. "Relocating?" she repeated. "Yes." "For how long?" "2 years." There was a rustle. She was likely putting the phone on speaker. Within seconds, I heard my father's voice faintly in the background. "London?" he asked. "Yes." "When did this happen?" "I accepted about 3 weeks ago." That detail shifted something subtle but significant. "You already accepted?" my mother said. "Yes." Not defensively, not apologetically, just factually. My father cleared his throat. "That's a big decision to make without talking to us." There it was. Not anger, expectation. I chose my words carefully. "It's a professional assignment. The timeline was tight." That was true. It was also incomplete. The fuller truth was that I no longer needed consensus to validate my growth. My father asked about housing costs. My mother asked about safety. Daniel, now also on speaker, asked about compensation and whether the role was actually worth it. I answered each question calmly. Numbers, logistics, structure. Not once did I defend my emotional readiness. Eventually, my father said the line I had anticipated. "Are you sure you're ready for something that intense?" The phrasing was familiar. In the past, I would have softened my response, offered reassurance, explained how I would manage stress. This time, I kept it simple. "I am." No elaboration. Silence again, thinner now, less compressed. The conversation moved on to practicalities. When would I leave? Would I visit during the summer? What time difference would we be dealing with? But beneath the surface, I sensed the recalibration happening in real time. They weren't upset that I was leaving. They were adjusting to the reality that I had acted independently, at scale, without first inviting their evaluation. That was the disruption, not rebellion. Autonomy. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes. My mother texted more frequently, small check-ins framed as casual curiosity. My father sent me articles about international taxation. Daniel asked sharper questions about the executive structure of my company. They were trying to map this new version of me, and I let them. I didn't over-explain. I didn't seek approval. I didn't dramatize the move into something symbolic. I simply continued executing. Final utilities canceled. Farewell dinners scheduled. Suitcases were weighed and reweighed. On my last evening in Seattle, I stood in my nearly empty apartment. Mattress, suitcase, one lamp. There was no swelling music, no cinematic tears, just space. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding my family's perception in my hands, trying to gently reshape it. I had set it down. I had moved in silence. And now, whether they fully understood it or not, my life had expanded beyond the borders they had quietly drawn for me, not loudly, not rebelliously, but irreversibly. Consequences rarely arrive as confrontation. They arrive as an absence. London was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in tempo. The city moved with quiet urgency. People walked quickly, spoke precisely, and guarded their time carefully. I adapted faster than I anticipated. The first week was orientation. The second was immersion. By the third, I was presenting regional risk assessments to a team that had no context for who I used to be. There was something liberating about that. No one here knew me as the stable one. No one expected me to neutralize tension. No one framed my discipline as caution. They saw output, strategy, leadership under pressure, and I delivered. Back home, the structural shift began subtly. Thanksgiving arrived without me coordinating flights. My mother managed it herself, imperfectly. A dinner reservation was double booked. Daniel arrived late because no one had aligned schedules clearly. My father, I later heard, was mildly frustrated. No one blamed me, but something had been removed from the system. A few weeks later, Daniel called unexpectedly. "Mom's stressed," he said. "You know how she gets around the holidays." "I do," I replied. He paused. "It's different without you organizing everything." There was no accusation in his voice, just observation. "That's understandable," I said calmly. "You could have at least walked her through it," he added. "I considered that carefully." "I'm adjusting here too," I said. "There's a lot to manage." Silence. It wasn't hostile. It was recalibrated again. For years, my availability had been automatic. Emotional, logistical, structural. Now it requires scheduling across time zones. My absence forced redistribution. My mother began calling Daniel more often. He sounded less amused about it. Marissa was asked to handle arrangements occasionally. She forgot details. My father started using spreadsheets for holiday planning. They were learning tasks I had quietly carried for years, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because I was no longer compensating. One evening during a video call, my mother studied my face closely. "You seem different," she said. "How?" "More confident." I almost smiled. "I've always been confident," I replied gently. She hesitated. "No, I mean, you seem certain." That word lingered. Certain. Perhaps that was the real consequence. When you stop negotiating your identity, it becomes more defined. A few days later, my father asked about my workload. I described a tense executive review where I had defended a controversial capital allocation model under scrutiny. You handled that? He asked, surprised. Yes. Alone? Yes. There was a long pause. Well, he said slowly, that's impressive. It wasn't effusive. It wasn't dramatic. But it was new. The consequences weren't explosive. They were gradual recognition. My family wasn't losing me emotionally. They were losing the version of me that made their lives frictionless. And in that loss, something uncomfortable surfaced for them and empowering for me. I had not rebelled. I had not argued. I had not accused them of underestimating me. I had simply removed myself from the role they had assigned, and the space I left behind was forcing them to see me differently. Not because I demanded it, because reality required it. The shift became undeniable the following spring. I flew home for a brief visit, 4 days, carefully scheduled between executive reviews in London. When I walked into my parents' house, nothing looked different. Same framed photographs, same polished dining table, same lemon-scented candles my mother always burned. But the energy felt altered. There was a caution in it, as if everyone was aware, consciously or not, that I was no longer the predictable variable. Dinner that first night was polite, almost formal. Daniel asked thoughtful questions about London. My father listened more than he spoke. My mother studied me the way she used to when I was a child coming home from school, scanning for signs of distress or change. Halfway through the meal, my father said, "We didn't realize how much you handled until you left." It wasn't accusatory. It was reflective. I set down my fork gently. "I didn't realize how much I handled either," I replied. That was the truth. Absence clarifies weight. My mother exhaled slowly. "You should have told us earlier," she said. "About the move. We felt surprised." There it was, the emotional residue. "I know," I said calmly. "You could have talked it through with us," she added. "We might have had good input." The phrasing was careful. Input, not permission. But the implication lingered. I held her gaze. "Would you have encouraged it?" Silence stretched across the table. My father shifted slightly in his chair. Daniel looked down at his plate. My mother didn't answer immediately. "That's not the point," she said finally. But it was. For years, encouragement had been conditional. Gentle skepticism had been the norm. Concern had often replaced curiosity. I didn't say any of that aloud. Instead, I chose precision. I needed to know I could decide something that big without cushioning it for everyone else. I said evenly. My father frowned slightly. "Cushioning?" "Yes," I replied, explaining it in a way that made it feel less overwhelming, less risky, less unlike me. The room stilled. No one argued, because no one could deny the pattern completely. My mother's voice softened. "We never meant to make you feel small." "I know," I said immediately. And I did. This wasn't about villainy. It was about perception hardened over time. But when you're repeatedly described as cautious, I continued gently, eventually, it starts to limit what people imagine you can handle. Daniel looked up. "We didn't think you could handle it," he said. "You sounded unsure," I replied. Not accusing, just factual. There was discomfort in the silence that followed. Not explosive, just irreversible. Because once something is named calmly, it cannot be unnamed. My father leaned back slowly. "Maybe we underestimated you." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't apologetic in a cinematic way. It was quiet admission. And I realized something important in that moment. They were trying to adjust, but the old version of me was gone. Not emotionally, not relationally, structurally. I no longer needed them to see me as capable in order to feel capable. Their recognition, while meaningful, was no longer the source of my confidence. And that's the part that can't be reversed. You can't go back to seeking permission once you've proven to yourself that you don't need it. The dynamic had changed permanently, not because I cut them off, not because I punished them, but because I stepped outside the role and didn't return. The real confrontation didn't happen at the dinner table. It happened the next morning in my parents' kitchen while my mother poured coffee into two identical white mugs. The house was quiet. My father had stepped out for a walk. Daniel was still asleep in his old bedroom down the hall. It was just us. She handed me a mug and leaned against the counter, studying me again. Not with worry this time, but with something closer to curiosity. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Of course." "Did you feel like we didn't believe in you?" There was no defensiveness in her tone, no edge, just vulnerability. I didn't rush to answer. "I don't think you meant not to," I said carefully. "But I think you believed in a specific version of me." She frowned slightly. "What version?" "The one who keeps everything steady," I replied. "The one who doesn't need much. The one who avoids unnecessary risk." "That's not a bad thing," she said quickly. "It isn't," I agreed. "Unless it becomes a ceiling." The word landed softly between us. "Ceiling." She absorbed it in silence. "I worried about you," she admitted. "You've always been sensitive." I almost smiled at that. "I'm disciplined," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." She looked down into her coffee. "Maybe we confused the two." That was as close to acknowledgement as she had ever come. There was no apology speech, no dramatic realization, just incremental understanding. And I realized something in that moment. I didn't need more than that. I wasn't there to extract regret. I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to establish clarity. "I didn't tell you sooner because I knew it would turn into reassurance," I said calmly. "I would have spent weeks convincing you I could handle it." Her eyes lifted to mine. "And I didn't want to convince anyone," I continued. "I just wanted to decide." She nodded slowly. "That must have been lonely," she said quietly. It surprised me. Not because she was wrong, but because she saw it. "It wasn't lonely," I replied after a moment. "It was necessary." That was the difference. Loneliness implies abandonment. Necessity implies growth. When my father returned, the conversation didn't escalate. There was no family summit, no collective apology. Instead, he asked me about my London team and listened, not with skepticism, with interest. Daniel, later that afternoon, admitted, "I didn't think you'd actually go." "I know," I said. He shook his head lightly. "Guess I underestimated you." There was no bitterness in me when he said it, because I wasn't standing there trying to reclaim something. I was simply occupying the space I had already earned. The confrontation had happened without heat, no raised voices, no accusations, no scorekeeping, just truth, stated calmly enough that it couldn't be dismissed as emotion. And in that calmness, something shifted permanently. They no longer saw me as fragile, not because I demanded respect, but because I demonstrated depth and refused to shrink it for comfort. London changed me, but not in the way people imagine cities change you. It didn't make me louder. It didn't make me colder. It didn't make me ruthless. It made me integrated. For the first time in my life, my internal identity and external perception began to align. At work, I lead cross-border financial strategy for climate infrastructure investments. I negotiate with partners who test assumptions aggressively. I defend projections in rooms where disagreement is expected. No one here confuses discipline with fear. When I say no, it's heard as discernment. When I pause, it's read as a calculation. When I speak, it's because I've decided it's necessary. And something subtle has followed me back into my family dynamic. When we speak now, across time zones, across contexts, the tone is different. My father asks for my analysis on his retirement portfolio without prefacing it with jokes about my cautious nature. My mother tells her friends I'm leading an international division, and there's pride in her voice, not relief that I'm stable. Daniel calls to discuss strategy, not to tease. The shift wasn't loud, it was cumulative. But the most important transformation didn't happen in them. It happened to me. I no longer scan their reactions before making decisions. I don't pre-edit my ambitions to make them digestible. I don't soften my achievements with self-deprecating humor. And I don't rush to fill the silence to keep everyone comfortable. If there's tension, I let it exist because I've learned something essential. Peace built on self-erasure is fragile. Peace built on clarity is stable. I used to believe that being loved meant being agreeable. That harmony required me to absorb doubt quietly. Now I understand that real harmony requires accuracy. You can love your family deeply and still reject the version of you they've preserved out of habit. You can honor their intentions and still outgrow their expectations. I didn't stand up against my family with defiance. I stood up by standing still, by refusing to shrink, by refusing to explain myself into something smaller, by choosing my path fully, even when it unsettled them. And the irony? Once I stopped negotiating my strength, they began recognizing it. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. I am still steady. I am still analytical. I am still disciplined. But I am no longer the invisible infrastructure. I am the architect. And the difference between those two roles is ownership. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic moral, a clean resolution, a triumphant ending, a final moment where everyone applauds and says, "We were wrong about you." That's not how this works. My family didn't transform overnight. I didn't deliver a speech that rewrote our history. There were no tears, no cinematic reconciliations. What changed was quieter than that. I stopped asking for permission to grow. That's it. For years, I believed that being loving meant being agreeable, that being responsible meant being predictable, that disappointing people you care about was a kind of betrayal. But here's what I learned. If the version of you that keeps everyone comfortable requires you to stay small, it isn't harmony, it's containment. And containment can look like care. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are not trying to limit you. They are trying to protect the version of you that makes sense to them, the one they understand, the one that fits neatly into the family system. But growth is disruptive. And if you wait until everyone is comfortable with your expansion, you may never move at all. Standing up against my family's prejudices didn't require anger. It required clarity. It required me to say, quietly but firmly, "You may see me one way, but I know who I am becoming," and then act accordingly. I didn't shout. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't cut ties. I chose my path fully, responsibly, without negotiation. And that choice reshaped everything. So I want to ask you something, gently, honestly. Is there a version of you that your family still sees, that you've already outgrown? And if there is, what would it look like to move forward anyway? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments.